Rightio. Hello, everybody. My name is Makala. I am Jared, and have Adam. Probably better, Adam, if you could come in. Getting all the static.
I've just muted everyone, but Makala, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Lovely. There you go. I'm currently unmuted. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. There's 52 people online. This is a chat with the committee session that runs for about an hour and was set up by the previous chair and has been running for about 2 years in an effort to add transparency to the exam process. So what happens is that you get the opportunity to be able to ask any questions you like about the exam, about the process, and anything that you are particularly concerned about. So 2 things. Number one, we're taping this, aren't we, Adam? We're about to.
Yeah.
So that you can
record it.
Yeah. So we're taping it so you can watch it later. 2 is that Adam is going to be the moderator because I usually forget about watching for the hands and things. So there you go, Simon. There's the answer to your question. And you also have other examiners who are online with me. So you've got Sarah and Shamala. So Sarah is New Zealand and Shamala is from Melbourne. There were a couple of other people. Kylie sends her apologies. She's proning someone at the moment. She's in New Zealand as well. So what I thought we would do first is I'm just going to take you through a quick run of some things just to start the ball rolling because that is important. All right, there you go. And you should be able to see from the beginning. Okay, now I can't see anyone anymore. So Adam, hopefully, is going to tell me that everyone can see that. And
I can certainly see it.
Sweet, okay. And so let's just go through a couple of things and the time is yours to break in anytime you like. I won't hear you, but Adam will pick it up in the chat and tell it to me, or he will text me because my phone is on. All right, so roughly what I'm going to quickly go through and interrupt at any time is 1, an update on the syllabus, 2, an update on the ACE report, because I know you're going to be wanting to ask about that. 3, some update on the feedback from last week's National SAQ session. I will go through that feedback in more detail at the next week's National SAQ session, but since you guys are sitting in 4 weeks and 1 day, you should have the feedback about SAQs early because you are directly the target audience at the moment for that. And then we'll go through a couple of FAQs about the written, about the logistics and about the marking that I have had before. So that is it. So first of all, let's have an update on the syllabus, shall we? In terms of the syllabus, next Monday, I will wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I will catch a plane to Melbourne, and then there will be the last big syllabus day, which starts at 10, it ends at 5. Hey, Dave, he's coming in. So the syllabus day on the Monday starts at 10, ends at 5. And we will hammer out the last draft, the final draft all day, and then it'll be shown to the board. Once it's shown to the board, great, then we have to test it. So will it be ready for the paper? Well, it was never going to be, and we talked about that in the last workshop. I doubt that it will actually be ready for the first paper next year. It'll probably be ready in the middle of the year after testing because it has to be shown to the committee. It has to be shown to the training committees as well. There has to be feedback on it before it's actually finalised, and then we'll start to test it. But the syllabus is closer than it's been before, and that is the update on the syllabus. Okay, so what about the ACE report? Well, they are meeting with the executive next week. The board meeting is next week. So what happens is that first of all, the ACE will give the report to the board executive, and that is the president, the vice president, and the chancellor. So that's Rob Evan and Peter Kruger. And after that, it gets presented to the board. And after it gets presented to the board and they discuss it at board level, then it goes all the way through and then it filters down to all the committees, one of which is me. It's not totally me because there are 3 exams. And so some of it might be relevant to the exams in terms of general process. But that's where we are with the ACE report. What is in the ACE report? I don't know. It is independent, but I'm sure they will let me know. What do I do about the ACE report? Well, that depends what's in it, and I will let you know about that as well. So we will see. Okay, so after that, I thought that we just have a little bit of feedback from the last week's SAQ question. And the reason why is because there were some questions about SAQs, and I thought that you should have more of an opportunity than the general run of senior trainees because you are going to be sitting in 4 weeks and 1 day. So first of all, thank you very much to all the people who did give some feedback and write in. I thought that we might get 50, 60 people online. We had 130. And that's great because I really thought that there was a need for this. And by turning up, you have actually demonstrated that. So I really appreciate that. There are a lot of people who worked really hard on that. We will talk about various bits and pieces of lots of feedback next week in the workshop. But here is some specific feedback about some of the workshops, about some of the SAQs. Now, to dose or not to dose. So there was some confusion by some SRs, not others. Some wrote in and said, thanks for explaining it. Others wrote in and said, it is still completely opaque. So I'll try again. One of the difficulties that people had was the one on the left, discuss the assessment and initial management of an intubated patient with cardiogenic shock. Nick, the consultant at the time, who was looking at this, said, don't worry about the doses. You need to just put things down and you need to cull your answer. So he was talking about a candidate that had written an answer and had helpfully said, this answer took me 16 minutes. It took me 6 minutes to get up to here, 9 minutes to get up to here. Then I'm over time. I've still got some left. And it took basically 16 minutes for him to finish his answer, or her, de-identified. And then I came along 3-4 questions later and I said, here is a question. Outline your manager's septic shock with a vascular disaster who is growing staph. And what you need to do is you need to be able to deep dive into the management of septic shock. And so if you're going to write any drugs, then doses are really good. Putting the outline of when you're going to use your first one, when you're going to put in your second one, what's your third line therapy, this is really good. And so some people said, you've got two examiners and they said completely different things. Can you bloody people make up your mind? And I thought, you know what? I understand why there's some confusion there. I do. Let's have a bit of a deeper dive into why one of us said just the basics, and the other one says has a deep dive. The reason why I've put up these two SAQs here is because you can see that they're two different types of questions. Now, you should be able to see my little pointer here because I'm the host of this. So the pointer's on the left-hand side doing little spinny circles at the moment. Can you see your answers should include, but not limited to, the following headings? Potential likely causes, that's 1. Suggested diagnostic approach, that's 2. Key elements of the management of likely causes, so that's, specific causes, that's 3. And they've told you that if you can put a fourth heading in, that would be good. So 4 divided by 100 is roughly 20% each. So one of the things about SAQs that are really useful is that when you look at the SAQs, you'll notice that over the last couple of times, we've gotten more and more specific about what marks are for where. And they are clues. They let you know where you should put most of your effort and most of your work. So here, they're equal. Because it's just 100% and no one has really put in any particular approach to that, they will all be equal. So you've got around about 20% each. This one's different. This is the one that I was talking about last week. This is your, I've got no blood pressure and I've got septic shock and I've got staph. And there's 70% of the marks are going to be given for part B. So you've got 10 minutes per question, 17 minutes per mark. So that's around about 7 minutes that you've got to write on the management of septic shock. When I was talking about this particular one, there, if you remember, the candidate's answer had a lot of guff in the management section, and a lot of it was assessment, which gains no marks because they've asked you for management. Therefore, you would be expected to put more detail in a septic shock question where it's talking specifically about drugs, because let's face it, in septic shock, what else you got to treat it with? Just drugs. Whereas if you've only got 20% of a cardiogenic shock question, cardiogenic shock, yes, absolutely, you do treat it with drugs, but a lot of it is mechanical intervention. You're going to talk about your pacing. You're going to talk about the fact that there may be a valvular incompetence. You might need a balloon pump if you've got ventricular failure to help with that. You might need ECMO. Once again, these are all mechanical courses. And yes, you do need drugs as well. But that's why you do more of a deep dive into this one than this one. And what will help you is knowing how many marks are available for it. And that will guide you as to the level of detail as required. So I hope that that's been helpful in talking to people about what you need to do and how much depth that you need to go into for certain different things, hopefully. But I am totally happy to answer any questions about the exam feedback for that one again. But that was the big one. The big one that people were really annoyed about. Fair enough. I understand why that's very confusing if you've never met this before. Is if one examiner is saying don't get into too much detail about drugs and the other one saying do get into too much detail, it's context. It's all about the context. Context is what we live for in our clinical life and in the exam as well. Okay. So the other feedback that we had was about the renal replacement therapy. We were talking about critically evaluate the drug doses. Critically evaluate the dosage or versus the timing. That was the timing of the renal replacement therapy. That was the critically evaluate question. And I said, if you want to, you could put in something about dose as well. Because if you're running out of things to say, put something down and you never know, the examiner might be feeling generous, even though the question is about timing of renal replacement therapy. If you could talk about timing and when it comes in with dosing, that would be better. Stick to the question. Stick to the question. But if you really can't think of anything, write anything. But that's what I meant. I can see how that's confusing too. I'm very sorry. Okay, so that was the basic feedback from the workshop. There was a little bit more, but that isn't directly relevant to sitting the written exam, and this is all about sitting the written exam. Right.
Michaela, there's a couple of questions coming through on the chat.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have a look at those? And because you've read them and I haven't, I'll read them now.
So the first one's about the exam brief saying analog watches only. Are we allowed to use digital clocks that make no sound? That's the first question.
Yeah. So you're all going to Clifton's. You're all going to Clifton's or affiliations of Clifton's, and Adam and I have been sort of talking about this. And so it depends on just how strict and hard-ass the particular Clifton staff are. And usually they're very strict because that's their job. That's their job, that's their profession. They are the gatekeepers and they do that job for us. There are big clocks all over the rooms that you will be in. I myself had a running watch that was GPS, but I wouldn't call GPS particularly smart. I had the 225 Garmin running watch. And so if you're talking about that sort of digital watch with a large digital round face on it, then yeah, you should be able to use that because it's clearly not internet competent. Or you could go retro old school and use a Casio.
And I guess on the flip side of that, Michaela, is another question is a lot of people will ask about smartwatches and switching to flight mode and things like that. Clifton's will ask all candidates to remove smartwatches, just like you would when you come for the clinical exam, and place those in your bag. And you can't use those, much like your mobile phone. And then another point is Clifton's will also ask you if you're wearing any type of watch to remove it and place it on the desk in front of you rather than on your wrist. So Clifton's are quite strict on that sense. So it would be my recommendation is to make sure you have a watch that's not going to beep, not going to have internet capability, and if you've got a smartwatch, maybe pop it in your bag before you get to the venue, or choose to wear your retro watch for the day. I guess the next question is, do we write our candidate number on every page or just on the front of the booklet?
You definitely have to write it on the front of the booklet. And I believe that you have to write it on every page as well. Yeah.
It is kindly asked, and this is more to help with the college staff after your papers will come back, and with a large number of your papers, and collating them and ensuring that your answered SAQs are clearly labelled for the examiners to mark. It is very helpful if you clearly label your candidate number on each top of each paper, or sorry, each page of your booklet. If you do miss one or two, and that's human nature to do so, don't feel bad about it afterwards. We do check very diligently before we start marking the papers. Just ensure you, I guess, label the start of your SAQ very clearly. And if you answer the same, so 2 SAQs in a booklet, just make sure you start your next SAQ on another page and label that very clearly. That will help us at the college staff and help the examiners to ensure they're marking the right questions for the right candidates.
Personally, I would make really, really sure in the most important exam of my life thus far that everybody knew what belonged to me. So there was no possibility that would actually get mixed up and have my candidate number across the top, just purely for me. While we're talking about Cliftons, Adam and I were talking about this before. As I mentioned before, we have changed it so that you are allowed to take your paper home. When you've finished with it and when it's done, you should be able to take your paper home. Now, humans being what they are, even if you stipulate that the candidates are allowed to take their examination material at home, that is not always the case with some exams, and therefore maybe it will get mixed up, the message. And so some Cliftons people will say, nope, that's not what we do. That's not part of the thing. I don't want that to happen, but if it does, do not fret. We have a backup plan. And the backup plan is that the paper will be online within 2 weeks, so that at least you will be able to have access to it, even if you can't walk out with it in your hand.
Maybe I'll clarify that that's the SAQ question paper, not your responses. Your responses will come back to the college after the exam.
Yeah. But the paper with all the SAQs on it, if you can't take it with you, you should be able to, but every now and then there is a stuff up. Then we will make sure that you have access to that online, and we will publish it, just like we published the paper early at the end of the last clinical week.
There's one more question.
Mm-hmm.
From Kate, thanks for your time, so much appreciated. Do you anticipate there'll be a large delay in releasing the written paper results, given a huger number of candidates sitting this time?
I really hope not, Kate. I really do. We will be trying our best, but we are indeed all daunted by the many, many people that are sitting. This is an outsized cohort. So to the best of our ability, we will try to make sure you get your results in the timeliest fashion you can. And if we can't, we will let you know, and we will let you know why, as early as we can. Do you have any other questions about the exam? Here we go.
Can I ask more about the Angoff method function? Something that struck me about the most recent sitting is a number of questions that had high passes, but the maximum mark was below 7 or 8. Is that something that the standard setting method would have anticipated in context?
Yeah, sure. Good question. That is one of the things that ACER is looking at.
Another question.
To answer that question, I'm not trying to put you off, Chris. I'm trying to dodge and avoid questions about the Angoff. But if I was to talk about the Angoff, then I would have to go into quite a lot of detail what the Angoff is, how the Angoff is calculated, how we set up the process so the Angoff is as robust as possible. And I would be more than happy to hold another workshop on the Angoff, but this one is specifically to get you through the paper and to answer questions about what you're going to have to do in 4 weeks and 1 day. And so that's what we're going to concentrate on. We're not going to slide this and make this a deep dive into the Angoff. If you would like to call me because you're a Queensland trainee and you'd like to ask specific questions, then that's fine. If you feel that you can't sleep tonight unless you really know all about the Angoff. But I don't think that this is the platform for Angoff when there's more to talk about in terms of being able to sit with the exam. Okay, sorry, you may have already gone through this last session. Yes, I did, but I'm very happy to do it again. The critically evaluate question timing. Why do we need to mention dosing? You don't have to mention dosing. You don't have to mention dosing in a question that is about timing. However, if there's nothing else that you can think about, you could always put it down. And if you could work dosing into timing somehow, then that would be good. Broad principles rather than anything else. But I wish I'd never mentioned it now. I was trying to help you get as much detail as you can for the question. No, it's totally fine. Totally fine, Chris. Happy to talk. It's just that this is not about the Angoff, but I'm happy to make it about the Angoff on another forum later on. Cassie, when the question says, what is the likely diagnosis? Is the expectation that there is one unifying diagnosis, or should you give multiple differentials? So that's a really interesting question, Cassie. And I am going to introduce the brilliant and amazing Sarah and Shamala. And I believe that David Knight is here as well. These are the awesome examiners that work with me. And I'm going to let you hear their highly experienced voices.
If it says is the likely diagnosis, we are looking for one likely diagnosis. If we want a differential, you will be asked for a differential, or you will be or the question will be worded differently and specifically, please suggest or please list likely diagnoses. So there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that the language is specific for each question. It's why we try and use the standardised glossary terms, and there's been more and more of a focus on this in the last couple of years, and will continue to be more of a focus so that we can be as precise with what we're asking you as possible. So I'd really encourage everyone here, when you read a question, circle the activity words, the words from the glossary that tell you how to tailor your answer, and circle anything that it tells you specifically what to do. So headings, diagnosis versus diagnoses, and mark weightings. Over to Shamala and David.
So I agree with what Sarah said. when they say likely diagnosis, this is usually going to be for a data question, usually. And if they have this as what is the likely diagnosis, they want you to give a diagnosis for the presentation on the data. If you want a list of differential diagnoses, we'll ask people, want a list of differential diagnoses for this clinical biochemical picture. So I think, as Sarah said, we are trying to clean up the way we ask questions so that it's as clear as possible for the candidates.
I'll just chip in there. So I couldn't agree any more with Sarah. The words we choose are very specific. A lot of time taken in choosing what word we write, and also answering each other's questions to make sure that we each understand what we mean as well. So I would interpret the way that's written as a single diagnosis.
We have another question. For compare and contrast questions, if the table will not fit vertically, is it okay to write the table horizontally? That's from Marwan. Everyone's nodding.
Yeah, as long as you
Of course.
Yeah. As long as you can fit it in, and most importantly, it's not cramped, because if it's cramped, sometimes it's very difficult to read. If it's difficult to read, it's difficult to give you marks. So use the paper the best way you see fit. And if your table needs to go over two sides, sideways, as opposed to just backwards and forwards, do that. Do that. We will adjust and move on. We will cope when we scan and the rest of it. But if you feel that you'd rather have landscape rather than portrait view to write, do that. The list question. Thanks, Jeff. I'll hand over to my colleagues so that you don't listen to my voice droning on all the time. But I do have an opinion.
So this is a little bit of a judgment call, Jeffrey, because I think you can be so broad as to be applying a pathological sieve, which will be unlikely to attract marks, but so specific that you would list 5 conditions that are really subsets of one problem. And so I think the guidance here is a little bit more nuanced. I think if there are 5 indications, you are best to be specific but separate, if at all possible. And so list them for actual conditions, reasons that a patient, you would say this patient has this problem, and this is the indication for why I would, we're using plasma exchange because this person has first diagnosis of Wegener's and pulmonary hemorrhage. So you would say the problem there is Wegener's, so plasma exchange Wegener's, as opposed to autoimmune conditions, which is not to say that the term autoimmune conditions would not attract marks, but I think being slightly more specific would. However, if you listed all 5 autoimmune conditions that were all really similar to each other, that's potentially problematic as well. So, it's not concrete guidance I'm giving you here, but I would say use your judgment. Try and be specific but reasonably broad, depending on the context of the question. Over to others' input.
I think depending on how specific the question is, Jeff, is also how specific your answer needs to be, because they've said list 5. 5 is a really, really specific 5. But if they've said list indications, then you probably need to broaden it up. The other clue that you're going to have is not just in the wording, how specific it is, but also in the marking. So if they said list the indications for plasma exchange, 70% of your answer is worth this, then you will need big broad headings and you will need lots of examples, because you have to write for 7 minutes. But if they said list the indications for plasma exchange, 10%, then I would suggest that a shorter list would be more appropriate, because it's clear that 90% of the time they would like you to spend on the other bits of the question. And so using a combination of specificity of the question, content of the question, and marking of the question, and marking weight of the question, will be able to give you a clue as to how far down the rabbit hole you would like to go, or they would like you to go.
Yep. And the other thing is that if suppose you are writing the list, if you mention 5 autoimmune causes, you're less likely to get marks, right? So when if there are multiple categories, it's best to mention categories and the condition, categories and the condition. That'll score you much more marks. Okay? If you're going to say the same thing again and again, like all the different autoimmune diseases, that's definitely not going to get you many marks.
We have another question from Kate. Some questions ask for advantages and limitations of 2 opposite approaches therapies with advantages of one. Due to the disadvantage of the other, can you list advantage, disadvantage of one therapy?
So if suppose this is in the kind of compare and contrast question, you're going to have 3 columns. The first column is going to be the actual subject. Second is, and the other 2 are going to be the contrasting conditions. And so if you say, for example, presence of fever in a particular condition, and it's present and it's absent in the 2 different conditions, then it's quite clear. if it's advantages and disadvantages. Similarly, if you have the category of the question in the first column, then you can easily write advantages and disadvantages, which will be the same point, but it will be plus minus, right? If I'm not clear, please ask me what I'm trying to say. I think I'm not as clear as I could be. Are you able to understand? So the first column would be a category of whatever you're going to say. An example is not coming to my mind immediately. But and if you have two other conditions where you have to list it as an advantage and a disadvantage, you can always see that if you write it that way. I know that it sounds repetitive, but it is the way you present it. It won't look repetitive anymore.
The other thing that I would do, Kate, is that I would have, I agree with you that the advantage of one is usually the disadvantage of the other, but I would be heavy on the detail of one, and then I would be light on the details on the other. For instance, the advantage of this is it is expensive in terms of resources, time, products, money, education. Other side, cheap. And that way you've said two things. You've gone into an enormous detail about the expense of one, and the other side you've just gone cheap. Does that help? And that way, by deep diving into the detail on one side about either the disadvantage or the advantage, and on the other side you've just contrasted it, that will help you save time, so you don't repeat but backwards the same thing, but you display the depth of knowledge required for the advantage versus the disadvantages. I hope that was clearer than my attempt to talk about dosing and replacement therapy, which I still feel guilty about. I'm sorry. Chris. Oh God, sorry, I was halfway through the chat. It doesn't scroll. Data interpretation. Is there a hard preference between the delta gap or the delta ratio? No, because both of them come out to the same thing at the end. So whatever floats your boat. It'd be nice if you labelled it for us. And if you are going to use, if you're going to use numbers, and sometimes they ask you for it. Sometimes they ask you, please explain this ABG, and sometimes they will say, please outline this ABG under the following osmolar gap, blah blah blah. So they can do either or. But if you put your working in, so that even if you can't add up under pressure, spoiler alert, I can't. Then at least, and I always get the sums wrong. At least they know your logic is correct. Because if your logic is correct and you know the equation, it doesn't matter if you said 158 and the answer was 3. At least you've got I know what an osmolar gap is and I know how to find it. I just can't add up or subtract for nuts, and that will help you. Is it fine to write it as algorithm than in sentences? I'm sorry, Rajkumar, I don't actually understand what you mean. Is it fine to write it as algorithm than in sentences? For example, approach to a condition. Thanks.
Rajkumar, I think I understand what you're trying to ask. You're trying to ask whether an approach to a condition can be written as a flow chart. Absolutely. You can write it as a flow chart as long as it makes good sense and it's clear.
Oh, good. Yeah, I didn't think of flow chart when I read that. If we wanted to write an answer hypophosphatemia, for example, can we write down arrow? Yeah, no, that's fine. You can write down arrowphosphate. Or PO4, that's fine.
You just need to make sure that whatever definition you're using, everybody understands. There's a lot of 3-letter abbreviations that get written that might be used commonly or in your institution that I've never heard of. So that down arrow phosphate, that would be perfectly logical. But 3-letter abbreviations that are not common, just be very cautious of those.
Kate. Yes, that's like, now I forgot what you've asked for, Kate, right at the beginning. But anyway. Okay, what do you understand by open and closed intensive care units? Outline the advantage. Okay, right, sorry, we're back to compare and contrast. Outline the advantages and limitations of each. Okay, now I understand what you're trying to say, so it's clearer to me as well. No, that's all right, it's fine. I don't mind if you can't talk on the microphone. Your typing is better than mine. So the advantages is not, the limitations is sometimes not the same as the disadvantages, but I do realise that is a very moot point, and semantics are not your friend. So that's a difficult one. I would just write down everything I could think of and keep going when you're talking about advantages versus limitations / disadvantages. I do remember the discussion in the exam court about this particular question about open versus closed intensive care units. Some of them, I don't think you call them disadvantages, but there's certainly limitations. For instance, it's not a disadvantage that you lock people out of your unit and that you don't allow them to dictate the therapy and that you ban respiratory therapists from coming in and filling with the ventilator. That's not an advantage of a disadvantage, but the limitations may be that subspecialty input may be ignored, overlooked, or difficult to access because you don't have the free flow of information that you do have with an open unit, which is not a disadvantage unless you choose to look at it that way. It's more of a limitation, but that's a very fine detail. That's what, now I understand why you're talking about advantages and limitations. Read the anion gap. To clarify, we should use the equation that doesn't include potassium and doesn't correct for albumin. You're usually supposed to correct for albumin, and every now and then we have to sort of re-release something. And the fact that we have to keep re-releasing it means that it's not written clearly or in a in a place that's able to find in the first place. So that's clearly something that we have to fix. But that is one of the reasons why I think you should put down your equations and exactly what is in the equation, because depending on what textbook you use, you'll have potassium, you won't have potassium. Correcting from albumin, you won't. So that's why I think you should do that. Just be as clear as you can about your rationale and your logic for getting those, for explaining the gases and the equations that you are using. For instance, the osmolarity, some people do 2 times the sodium plus whatever, and other people do 1.98. Fine. Write it down so that we know what we're talking about. If we show a calculation for the data question, where should we write it? In the middle of the answer, down the side, on a separate piece of paper. Previously, Professor Cohen has complained that this makes it hard to read the answers as it is too messy. He is, of course, a very short-sighted man. As long as you've got a lot of space in there, you can write it anywhere you want. As long as a reasonable human can read it at 2 a.m. while waiting for the redo, which then bled and then had to come back for the tamponade, and you're waiting for it to come back, and you're on your 4th cup of coffee, and you can still read it, that's fine with me. Ask me how I know. Because that's when we mark all our papers. We mark them after we've done our clinic work or when we've got a spare moment, and that's usually after hours, waiting for the latest heart disaster to come back.
And other thing is that if you're doing the calculations on the sheet, then as long as it makes sense, it's okay. If suppose it is just numbers and you're not actually labeled what numbers they are, and you're just calculating for, it's like, something that you should have probably done in the side in a rough column or something. I mean, if it makes sense what you're calculating, they're well labeled, there's nothing wrong. But if you're just writing numbers and you're calculating as though it's a rough page, then definitely it is something which makes the whole answer quite messy.
Dave, I'm going to flick this one to you from Sharif.
Just reading the second chapter.
Yes.
Question.
Because you've got about 4 questions in there at once. So I'll tell you what, I'll answer the first paragraph. And you answer the next paragraph. Should I mention my specific or my approach, or should I explore all the options even if it's not done in reality? I think there's a lot to unpack in that very small sentence. So let's have a crack at unpacking it. First of all, you have to realise that you've got 10 minutes per question. Second of all, you have to realise that it's really good to answer as many questions as you can, certainly as in deeper knowledge, in as much detail as you can. But the fact remains that you've got 15 questions per paper. In terms of should I mention my specific or my approach, or should I explore all the options even if it's not done in reality, this exam, that's a broad question that really goes to the heart of what this exam is about. This exam is about do you have the knowledge and the capacity, and do you have the application of said knowledge and capacity to be an independent practitioner, to be a safe transitional fellow. It used to be a safe junior consultant, but we're splitting hairs semantics again. Now we're saying that it's to be a safe transitional fellow. But I think the word in there is safe practice and independent practice and lack of oversight, because you don't need oversight, because you've just proven that you are somebody who can hold the keys to the unit. And therefore, you can answer that question for me. What is the person that is going to demonstrate that they have these capacity that we talked about? Is it somebody who can manage 107 ways to intubate somebody, including the retrograde wire upside down in an entrapped car hanging off Mount Kilimanjaro being watched by a giraffe? Or is it somebody who says, this is what I do, this is how I do it, I'm aware of these others, but this is my preferred reason because of this, and then I move on to this. So based on that, forget about the giraffe, I think that you should outline your approach. If you have time, you should detail other approaches. But we're interested in, as well as knowing your depth of knowledge, in knowing that you know how to use the knowledge that you have had so hard won over the last couple of years. And therefore, that will win you more points. And that will give you the mythical consultant approach, which is what we're all trying for. And to be honest, we never stop until we retire.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to get an idea about what you're thinking here, what you would actually do, as opposed to what you have read about, to give us an idea about what happens in your practice, where you're using the evidence in your practice. If you know that there are some things that were historically done, but recent evidence has put that into question, then perfectly okay to bring all of that up. But it's really trying to get to a more practical endpoint as opposed to a very theoretical endpoint, which is how some of the critically appraised questions were in the past. We're very much more interested in how you apply it at the bedside.
Specifically for the management questions and the assessment questions. They're the big ones. Good question, though. Great question. I'll just touch on the, should I write ECMO and mention the CESAR trial and the ALOA trial, or however you'd like to say it. It depends on what kind of question it is, whether you're going to justify your rationale with research. If the question is, this person's dying of septic shock and their blood cultures have grown staph, you may or may not get to marks for research. If your management strategy is safe and effective, you will get no marks for research. If your management strategy is not safe and effective and you haven't covered all the bases, because it is a treatment/management question. If it was a critically evaluate question, please evaluate oxygenation and ARDS. Yes, you should absolutely write the research, because it's a critically evaluate question and it's specifically targeted to research as opposed to specific management of a patient. And so once again, the context of the question is going to determine the slant of the detail that is required. And in terms of the HOFA, Nobody uses that anymore. But hey, put it down if you've got time. Should you write on both sides of the paper? Yes, you can. Unless you've got a pen that bleeds through to the back and the front and means that it's very difficult to scan. Yes, that's totally fine.
And I guess don't worry if you do write on both sides. When I say before, the college staff look at every single piece of paper, both sides of a piece of paper. We literally do, and make sure that, if you've written a question onto the next side of the page, an arrow is put by the college staff at the bottom to carry on, so the examiners just keep reading your responses. So that's why it's important to clearly label each SAQ as you answer them.
And the college staff are really amazing, because every now and then there's a booklet that the candidate has clearly flipped over 2 pages at once accidentally because they're just so busy, and they'll find it. They go through every single page in the booklet just to make sure there isn't some sneaky paragraphs or some sneaky stuff right at the end and a big wodge of blank pages in the middle, because sometimes that happens. So they do a great job.
Can I just go to the previous question regarding that oxygenation? If suppose the question is discuss the strategies to improve oxygenation in ARDS, then you're going to mention each strategy, whether it is going to be ventilatory strategy or other strategies, and you discuss. So you're going to give the rationale and you're going to give the advantages and disadvantages. And at the end of it, you will also mention if whatever evidence is there for that. If it's a clinical question, you're actually given a clinical scenario with a patient who has poor oxygenation, then you obviously have to contextualize to that question and write what are the strategies that you are going to do for this patient, and then give rationale for that.
Jeff, no, they're not very strict at all for data interpretation. They really are the same thing. But it's always good to check. Thank you. That's why this platform is here. And the platform is nearly finished. Actually, it's an hour. Happy to answer any other questions. I hope it was helpful. And if there's anything else that you would like to talk about, now would be the time. Or you can flick Adam an email, and he will pass it on, and we will attempt to get back to you. If like family conferences, as soon as the doctor walks out of the room, the family thinks of one more thing. That's usually the case with things like this as well.
Yes, there will be blank A4 paper available. Whether Clifton's put some on every desk or you have to ask for it, there definitely is lots of blank paper for you to scribble and things like that during your exam. Any more questions? Oh, thanks, Cassie. I guess a lot of you are probably asking, when will you find out when you will get to sit or where you're sitting your exam? The city location that you advise the college in your application, that's where you're sitting in that city. No one is going to have to go, say, from Cairns to Townsville or things like that. So if you put your sitting in Cairns, unless something dramatically changes over the coming days, you'll be sitting your exam in Cairns and same Townsville, etc. But we are hoping to confirm the exact time and address of your location by Friday this week. There's a couple of other questions. Can you take a simple calculator?
As long as it's not programmable, you can take your calculator. And will next week's session be a duplicate or a different one? Different one. Different examiners. We had the pre-workshop meeting for that earlier on today. There'll be different examiners. There'll be different questions. The format will be roughly the same because that seemed to work. This time we're going to go faster. We're going to see if we can get even more questions in. Some of the feedback was that we talked about how to improve their answer, but it would be good if we could see a better answer. And I think that's fair because it's a very visual medium that you are communicating with the examiners in. I think that's a really, really excellent piece of feedback. So there will be either an excellent answer or an answer that is excellent and more excellent, and you will be able to see them and see the difference. So when we say, here is an answer that's technically correct, but it really doesn't have the depth of consultant knowledge that we like, and there's a really good one coming up, have a look, then we will show it to you. So they will be different questions. They will be different examiners. There will be 2 examiners per question. So you'll be able to have a bit more of a backwards and forwards and slightly contrasting views because that's what happens in real life. And you will have more examples of this is what we mean when we say this is a more effective way to present that information. And that's the plan for that workshop.
Sorry, Adam, I'm going to ask you a question which many of my trainees have asked and I don't know. Can they actually highlight words on the question paper? Can they mark on the question paper?
Not for the 10 minutes that you have to read the paper. So the format, if you've sat a college exam before, you get released, entered into the room 15 minutes before the start of the exam. The first 5 minutes is the invigilator giving you instructions. And then you get 10 minutes just to read the question. So that's all you can do. You can't write, you can't scribble, highlight, anything like that. But I guess once you start writing, so the 2.5 hours from writing, you can scribble, highlight, whatever on that question booklet. That's okay. That's fine. But during that 10-minute reading, all you're doing is sitting there and reading, basically. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yep, thanks, Adam.
Kate, answer that question. Can you write your candidate number on the booklets prior to the examination time? I'm going to say no, because the logistics of doing that with Clifton's and the number of instructions we give them, and they have to give you, it just is going to limit that. And I would hate for any candidate to be kind of removed from the exam when they're not meant to be writing for the wrong reasons by accident. So it's probably easier once you start, whether you allow yourself 20 seconds to write on all booklets real fast, your number, or things like that. That's totally up to you, but nothing prior to the start of the exam time.
I've had a question that I've been asked many times, and the question is, how do I manage my time in the exam? And that's a hard one. And I would suggest that right now you should be practicing letting go of questions and moving on, which is a skill in itself. We really, really want to finish what we've started, and it's so tempting in the middle of an exam to just write just a little bit more on this question, and then you'll catch it up on the next question. That is actually extraordinarily difficult to do. And you also have the law of diminishing returns. The more you spend on one question, the more time you're going to spend for less and less and less sort of marks, because the first 4 marks of every question are usually easy, and then you have to work for them. So you're going to be working really hard at the end of your question to maybe to bring it up by 1 or 2 marks. When cut your losses, move on, get on to another question, answer all of them. Don't leave any question behind. That is going to be something that you'll have to practice now, because it's really hard to have the discipline under pressure to just let it go and move on, because we're type A people and we like to finish things. So I would now start practicing to time, not because that you want to finish your answer in time, but you want to stop your answer in time and get on to the next one. That would be my suggestion.
There's 2 more questions before we let everyone go and enjoy their evening.
Last session you mentioned there's a question about a trial in details, which are landmark trials, because there are millions of them. Are there any specific lists for the expected trials that can be called landmark, and what details exactly should we know? That's a really good question, and I think that is one of the things that we should do in the future, is to actually stipulate what the landmark trials are. The unofficial, unstipulated landmark trials has always been Ian Seppelt's much photocopied and much beloved trial list that the SAFE course used to hand out all the time. I would say that number 1, an absolute given, is any of the ANZICS trials. So any of the ANZICS trials are absolutely, completely, and totally, utterly fair game. Because really, especially the first one, the bloody SAFE study is mentioned every second breath that the scientific meeting gets together, because they're so proud of it because it was the first one. So they are absolutely fair game. Most of the big bottom line stuff, it's not an official website. It's written by people who absolutely love research, but all the big headings, the things that they look at, they are really your landmark trials. I would say a trial where N equals less than 100 is not a landmark trial at all. They're the really large multi-centre large ones. Remember also, when you're having a talk about critically evaluate, what they're not meaning is trials, they're meaning research and position statements. So a lot of people forget when they're doing those critically evaluate questions that actually, if you're talking about brain trauma, for example, that the Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines are totally fair game. Because in there they talk about steroids in brain injury, they talk about all the different bits and pieces. So absolutely, the Cochrane reviews, they're fair game too. Position statements, certainly position statements of the college, but also position statements from the ARC guidelines or the ERC guidelines, or the big stuff like the British Thoracic Society guidelines on bronchoscopy and treatment of pneumothoraxes. Any great big research-based or opinion-based piece by which we base our practice and reference them to the coroner is fair game in terms of research and literature. And I am a person, Sharif, that really cannot remember any numbers at all. I've already alluded to that. And so I was very pleased to know that you do not have to know an enormous amount of detail, such as there were specifically 8,903 on this arm, and there were 32 exclusions and with this and that. All you need to know is, it'd be nice if you knew where it was published, but it's not even essential to do that. If you know the nickname of the trial, you don't have to remember the page number or the date. If you knew the rough indications of what were the admission criteria and roughly what were the exclusion criteria and why, because you need to be able to talk about the limitations. What were the limitations of the trial, that they were able to be extrapolated to this population but not this population, and the basic results of the trial. That's all you need. If you want to go into more detail because you love it and you are clearly destined to be the next professor of research and you would like to knock Venkatesh, Udi et al. Off their perch, then go crazy, do it. But the absolute, that is not required. Should we write answer in a serial or as random number? Can I write the answer which I know better and keep the hard ones to the end? Yeah, you can do it in any order you like. You can do the easy ones first, you can leave the hard ones to later. Personally, I was not comfortable with that strategy for myself because as I said, multiple times now, I'm so glad this is being recorded, I can't remember much about numbers, and I was terrified that I would miss one. And so I just went from the first one to the last one and just made sure that I was strict on my discipline to drop it. Now, if I dropped it early because I didn't know much about it, great. I've got those minutes up my sleeve for the latest one. But you can answer them in any order you like, but we're going to mark them all. And if you don't answer them all, then that's going to be to your detriment. There is no one right way to attack the paper.
And also, I think if you do it in a random order, you're more likely to lose time because you're going to be flicking in and out of the question booklet. But if suppose there is a question that you absolutely do not know, then you're going to mark it on the question paper and come to it at the end, because there is a specific strategy for answering questions that you don't know much about at all.
Yeah, no more than 2 per booklet, but you can certainly have 1 per booklet. Right.
Cool.
I think that we're done. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your coming. I wish you the best in the next 4 weeks. I will see you online with a new bunch of my colleagues next week on Wednesday. And we will go from there.